Wednesday, the 1st of April, and that's B. Who's going to have a go at trying to type? B, what are you doing? Who's that? Bye, baby. B's going to go away now. Sorry about that timing. So we are moving on to chapter 11 of The Picture of Dorian Gray. You may remember yesterday that Dorian had managed to have the painting hidden away in the old schoolroom. And when he came downstairs, he was a bit worried that perhaps his valet would potentially go and find the painting. He was very worried about other people seeing the painting. Anyway, when he came downstairs, there was a book given to him by Lord Henry, and that was given alongside kind of the inquest information into what had happened to Sybil Vane. And Dorian is fascinated by this book. And I'm just trying to remember if I can summarize basically what it's about. But it was about this young Parisian who was trying to kind of experience all the passions and modes of thought of that he could, essentially. And this really fascinates Dorian, and you're going to see it being part of what motivates him as he's moving forward. Now, you may also remember in the story so far, there has been a glimmer of hope for Dorian. So partly he kind of is tempted to engage in sinful activities and behave in ways that are not always acceptable in society, but he also says there's hope that maybe he'll reform himself and he will be good, and that might be reflected in the painting. And I think you can be the judge of how that's going to go. If you were given eternal youth and good looks and with zero consequences, how well would you behave? And I guess that's what this book is exploring, this idea about this character Dorian Gray, who is not going to age, is not going to see the consequences of his sinful activities. So what's stopping him from behaving badly? Now, if you had a good moral centre, then that would prevent you, because you would want to err on the side of being good. But there's something in Dorian, or perhaps there's something in the influence of Lord Henry that is leading Dorian down a path of kind of degradation that's going to have an impact on his soul. But that's only going to be reflected in the painting, which Dorian doesn't, seem to be so worried about. So we're moving into chapter 11 now. Some of this gets a bit more complicated, this chapter here. So we're kind of seeing a few years after the painting has been hidden, what kind of life Dorian is leading. I hope you've had a good Wednesday, by the way. Just interrupting my flow there a little bit. Okay, so chapter 11. For years, Dorian Gray could not free himself from the influence of this book, or perhaps it would be more accurate to say that he never sought to free himself from it. He procured from Paris no less than 9 large paper copies of the first edition, and had them bound in different colours so that they might suit his various moods and the changing fancies of a nature over which he seemed at times to have almost entirely lost control. The hero, the wonderful young Parisian, in whom the romantic and the scientific temperaments were so strangely blended, became to him a kind of prefiguring type of himself, and indeed the whole book seemed to him to contain the story of his own life written before he had lived it. In one point he was more fortunate than the novel's fantastic hero. He never knew, never indeed had any cause to know, that somewhat grotesque dread of mirrors and polished metal surfaces and still water, which came upon the young Parisian so early in his life, and was occasioned by the sudden decay of a beauty that had once apparently been so remarkable. It was with an almost cruel joy, and perhaps in nearly every joy, as certainly in every pleasure cruelty has its place, that he had used to read the latter part of the book, with its really tragic, if somewhat over-emphasized account of the sorrow and despair of one who had himself lost what in others, and in the world, he had most dearly valued. For the wonderful beauty that had so fascinated Basil Hallward, and many others besides him, seemed never to leave Dorian. Even those who had heard the most evil things against him, and from time to time strange rumours about his mode of life, crept through London and became the chatter of the clubs, could not believe anything to his dishonour when they saw him. He had always the look of one who had kept himself unspotted from the world. Men who talked grossly became silent when Dorian Gray entered the room. There was something in the purity of his face that rebuked them. His mere presence seemed to recall to them the memory of the innocence that they had tarnished. They wondered how one so charming and graceful as he was could have escaped the stain of an age that was at once sordid and sensual. Often, on returning home from one of these mysterious and prolonged absences that gave rise to such strange conjecture among those who were his friends, or thought that they were so, he himself would creep upstairs to the locked room, open the door with the key that never left him now, and stand with a mirror in front of the portrait that Basil Hallward had painted of him, looking now at the evil and ageing face on the canvas, and now at the fair young face that laughed back at him from the polished glass. The very sharpness of the contrast used to quicken his sense of pleasure. He grew more and more enamoured of his own beauty, more and more interested in the corruption of his own soul. He would examine with minute care, and sometimes with a monstrous and terrible delight, the hideous lines that seared the wrinkling forehead or crawled around the heavy sensual mouth, wondering sometimes which were the more horrible, the signs of sin or the signs of age. He would place his white hands beside the coarse bloated hands of the picture and smile. He mocked the misshapen body and the failing limbs. There were moments, indeed, at night, when, lying sleepless in his own delicately scented chamber, or in the sordid room of the little ill-famed tavern near the docks, which, under an assumed name and in disguise, it was his habit to frequent, he would think of the ruin he had brought upon his soul, with a pity that was all the more poignant because it was purely selfish. But moments such as these were rare. That curiosity about life which Lord Henry had first stirred in him as they sat together in the garden of their friend seemed to increase with gratification. The more he knew, the more he desired to know. He had mad hungers that grew more ravenous as he fed them. Yet he was not really reckless, at any rate in his relations to society. Once or twice every month during the winter, and on each Wednesday evening while the season lasted, he would throw open to the world his beautiful house, and have the most celebrated musicians of the day to charm his guests with the wonders of their art. His little dinners, in the settling of which Lord Henry always assisted him, were noted as much for the careful selection and placing of those invited, as for the exquisite taste shown in the decoration of the table, with its subtle symphonic arrangements of exotic flowers, and embroidered cloths and antique plate of gold and silver. Indeed, there were many, especially among the very young men, who saw, or fancied that they saw, in Dorian Gray the true realization of the type of which they had often dreamed in Eton or Oxford days. A type that was to combine something of the real culture of the scholar with all the grace and distinction and perfect manner of a citizen of the world. To them he seemed to be of the company of those whom Dante describes as having sought to make themselves perfect by the worship of beauty. Like Gautier, he was one for whom the visible world existed. And certainly to him life itself was the first, the greatest of the arts, and for all the other arts seemed to be but a preparation. Fashion, by which what is really fantastic becomes for a moment universal, and dandyism, which in its own way is an attempt to assert the absolute modernity of beauty, had, of course, their fascination for him. His mode of dressing and the particular styles that from time to time he affected had their marked influence on the young exquisites of the Mayfair balls and Pall Mall Club windows, who copied him in everything that he did, and tried to reproduce the accidental charm of his graceful, though to him only half serious, fopperies. For, while he was but too ready to accept the position that was almost immediately offered to him on his coming of age, and found indeed a subtle pleasure in the thought that he might really become to the London of his own day what to imperial Neronian Rome the author of the Satyricon once had been, yet in his inmost heart he desired to be something more than a mere arbiter elegantarium, to be consulted on the wearing of a jewel, or the knotting of a necktie, or the conduct of a cane. He sought to elaborate some new scheme of life that would have its reasoned philosophy and its ordered principles, and find in the spiritualizing of the senses its highest realization. The worship of the senses has often, and with much justice, been decried, men feeling a natural instinct of horror about passions and sensations that seem stronger than themselves, and that they are conscious of sharing with the less highly organized forms forms of existence. But it appeared to Dorian Gray that the true nature of the senses had never been understood, and that they had remained savage and animal merely because the world had sought to starve them into submission or to kill them by pain, instead of aiming at making them elements of a new spirituality, of which a fine instinct for beauty was to be the dominant characteristic. As he looked back upon man moving through history, he was haunted by a feeling of loss. So much had been surrendered, and to such little purpose. There had been mad, wilful rejections, monstrous forms of self-torture and self-denial, whose origin was fear, and whose result was a degradation infinitely more terrible than that fancied degradation from which, in their ignorance, they had sought to escape. Nature, in her wonderful irony, driving out the anchorite to feed with the wild animals of the desert, and giving to the hermit the beasts of the field as his companions. Yes. There was to be, as Lord Henry had prophesied, a new hedonism that was to recreate life and to save it from that harsh, uncomely Puritanism that is having in our own day its curious revival. It was to have its service of the intellect, certainly, yet it was never to accept any theory or system that would involve the sacrifice of any mode of passionate experience. Its aim, indeed, was to be experience itself, and not the fruits of experience, sweet or bitter as they might be. Of the asceticism that deadens the senses, as of the vulgar profligacy that dulls them. It was to know nothing, but it was to teach man to concentrate himself upon the moments of a life that is itself but a moment. I was going to pause here and just say that this is all quite dense, this chapter. It's quite difficult for me to unpick everything that's being said here, and I'm reading it, and I'm sure that you might be kind of listening along and thinking, what on earth is he on about? Just bear with it, because it picks up, the plot picks up, and I think that what you've got to appreciate is that what Oscar Wilde is doing is exploring some quite complex ideas here, and essentially what this is about is Dorian being taken with the idea of basically being able to go out and do what he wants, and kind of engage in experience and senses and doing things, and not being constrained by Victorian society, which is very he saw as being quite Puritan and very restricted. So I apologise if you're getting a bit bored with this chapter. Please just bear with it, and just get the gist. It's fine. And then the pace picks up a bit later on in the book, I promise. Anyway, I'll carry on reading. Sorry. There are few of us who have not sometimes wakened before dawn, either after one of those dreamless nights that makes us almost enamoured of death, or one of those nights of horror and misshapen joy, when through the chambers of the brain sweep phantoms more terrible than reality itself, and instinct with that vivid life that lurks in all grotesques. I feel like I can't speak today. That lends to the Gothic art its enduring vitality. This art being, one might fancy, especially the art of those whose minds have been troubled with the malady of reverie. Gradually, white fingers creep through the curtains, and they appear to tremble. In black, fantastic shapes, dumb shadows crawl into the corners of the room and crouch there. Outside, there is the stirring of birds among the leaves, or the sound of men going forth to their work, or the sigh and sob of the wind coming down from the hills, and wandering round the silent house as though it feared to wake the sleepers, and yet must needs call forth sleep from her purple cave. Veil after veil of thin, dusky gauze is lifted, and by degrees the forms and colours of things are restored to them, and we watch the dawn, remarking the world in its antique pattern. The wan mirrors get back their mimic life. The flameless tapers stand where we had left them, and beside them lies the half-cut book that we had been studying, or the wired flower that we had worn at the ball, or the letter that we had been afraid to read, or what we had read too often. Nothing seems to us changed. Out of the unreal shadows of the night comes back the real life that we had known. We have to resume it where we had left off, and there steals over us a terrible sense of the necessity for the continuance of energy in the same wearisome round of stereotyped habits, or a wild longing, it may be, that our eyelids might open some morning upon a world that had been refashioned anew in the darkness of our pleasure, a world in which things would have fresh shapes and colours and be changed, or have other secrets, a world in which the past would have little or no place, or survive at any rate in no conscious form of obligation or regret, the remembrance even of joy having its bitterness, and the memories of pleasure their pain. It was the creation of such worlds as those that seemed to Dorian Gray to be the true object or amongst the true objects of life, and in his search for sensations that would be at once new and delightful and possess that element of strangeness that is so essential to romance, he would often adopt certain modes of thought that he knew to be really alien to his nature, abandon himself to their subtle influences, and then, having, as it were, caught their colour and satisfied his intellectual curiosity, leave them with that curious indifference that is not incompatible with the real ardour of temperament, and that indeed, according to certain modern psychologists, is often a condition of it. It was rumoured of him once that he was about to join the Roman Catholic communion, and certainly the Roman ritual had always a great attraction for him. The daily sacrifice, more awful really than all the sacrifices of the antique world, stirred him as much by its superb reduction of the evidence of the senses as by the primitive simplicity of its elements and the eternal pathos of the human tragedy that it sought to symbolize. He loved to kneel down on the cold marble pavement and watch the priest, in his stiff flowered dalmatic, slowly and with white hands moving aside the veil of the tabernacle, or raising aloft the jewelled lantern-shaped monstrance with that pallid water that at times once would fain think is indeed the panis celestis, the bread of angels, or, robed in the garments of the Passion of Christ, breaking the host into the chalice and smiting his breast for his sins. The fuming censers that the grave boys in their lace and scarlet tossed into the air like great gilt flowers had their subtle fascination for him. As he passed out, he used to look with wonder at the black confessionals and long to sit in the dim shadow of one of them and listen to men and women whispering through worn grating the true story of their lives. I'm going to pause that a minute. Sorry about that, just had to children. So I'm going to carry on from there. This is going on this chapter, isn't it? Apologise for that. But he never fell into the error of arresting his intellectual development by any formal acceptance of creed or system, or of mistaking for a house in which to live an inn that is but suitable for the sojourn of a night, or for a few hours of a night, in which there are no stars and the moon is in travail. Mysticism, with its marvellous powers of making common things strange to us, and the subtle antinomianism, no idea what that is, I'm going to look that up in a bit, that always seems to accompany it, moved him for a season, and for a season he inclined to the materialistic doctrines of the Darwinismist. I'm not impressing you today, am I, with my pronunciations? Movement in Germany, and found a curious pleasure in tracing the thoughts and passions of men to some pearly cell in the brain or some white nerve in the body, delighting in the conception of the absolute dependence of the spirit on certain physical conditions, morbid or healthy, normal or diseased. Yet, as has been said of him before, no theory of life seemed to him to be of any importance compared with life itself. He felt keenly conscious of how barren all intellectual speculation is when separated from action and experiment. He knew that the senses, no less than the soul, have their spiritual mysteries to reveal. I'm just going to say, if you want to read along, sometimes you might find that that's helpful. There's free access to this text on the Gutenberg project, so I'll put a link to it below. So if you're somebody who would rather read along, or maybe you'd like to read ahead, you don't want to wait, then by all means you can do that. And also might help you with some of these words I'm pronouncing really, really badly. And so he would now study perfumes and the secrets of their manufacture, distilling heavily scented oils and burning odorous gums from the East. He saw that there was no mood of the mind that had not its counterpart in the sensuous life, and he set himself to discover their true relations, wondering what there was in frankincense that made one mystical, and in ambergris that stirred one's passions, and in violets that waked the memory of dead romances, and in musk that troubled the brain, and in champak that stained the imagination, and seeking often to elaborate a real psychology of perfumes and to estimate the several influences of sweet-smelling roots and scented pollen-laden flowers, of aromatic balms, and of dark and fragrant woods, as spikenard that sickens, of heffeniad that makes men mad, and of aloes that are said to be able to expel melancholy from the soul. At another time he devoted himself entirely to music, and in a long latticed room with a vermilion and gold ceiling and walls of olive green lacquer, he used to give curious concerts in which mad gypsies tore wild music from little cithers, or grave yellow-shawled Tunisians plucked at the strange strings of monstrous lutes, while grinning negroes beat monstrously upon coppered drums, and crouching upon scarlet mats, slim turbaned Indians blew through long pipes of reed or brass, and charmed, or feigned to charm, great hooded snakes and horrible horned adders. The harsh intervals and shrill discords of barbaric music stirred him at times, when Schubert's Grace and Chopin's Beautiful Sorrows and the mighty harmonies of Beethoven himself fell unheeded on his ear. He collected together from all parts of the world the strangest instruments that could be found, either in the tombs of dead nations or among the few savage tribes that had survived contact with Western civilizations and loved to touch and try them. He had the mysterious Juriparis of the Rio Negro Indians that women are not allowed to look at, and that even youths may not see till they have been subjected to fasting and scourging, and the earthen jars of the Peruvians that have the shrill cries of birds, and flutes of human bones such as Alfonso de Oval heard in Chile, and the sonorous green jaspers that are found near Cuzco, and given forth a noise of singular sweetness. He had painted gourds filled with pebbles that rattled when they were shaken, the long clarion of the Mexicans into which the performer does not blow, but through which he inhales the air, the harsh chur of the Amazon tribes, and that is sounded by the sentinels, who sit all day long in high trees, and can be heard, it is said, at a distance of 3 leagues. The Tempenatzli that has 2 vibrating tongues of wood, and is beaten with sticks that are smeared with an elastic gum obtained from the milky juice of the plants. The yotl boughs of the Aztecs that are hung in clusters like grapes in a huge cylindrical drum, covered with the skins of great serpents, like the one that Bernal Diaz saw when he went with courts into the Mexican temple, and of whose doleful sound that has left us so vivid a description. The fantastic character of these instruments fascinated him, and he felt a curious delight in the thought that art, like nature, has her monsters, things of bestial shape and with hidden voices. Yet after some time he wearied of them, and would sit in his box at the opera, either alone or with Lord Henry, listening in rapt pleasure to Tannhauser, and seeing in the prelude to that great work of art a presentation of the tragedy of his own soul. On one occasion he took up the study of jewels, and appeared at a costume ball as Anne de Joyeuse, Admiral of France, in a dress covered with 560 pearls. This taste enthralled him for years, and, indeed, may be said never to have left him. He would often spend a whole day settling and resettling in their cases the various stones that he had collected, such as the olive green chrysoberyl that turns red by lamplight, and the symphane with its wire-like line of silver, the pistachio-coloured peridot, rose-pink and wine-yellow topazes, carbuncles of fiery scarlet with tremulous fall-rayed stars, flame-red cinnamon stones, orange and violet spinels, and amethysts with their alternate layers of ruby and sapphire. He loved the red gold of the sunstone, and the moonstone's pearly whiteness, and the broken rainbow of the milky opal. He procured from Amsterdam 3 emeralds of extraordinary size and richness of colour, and he had a turquoise de la Ville Roche that was the envy of all the connoisseurs. He discovered wonderful stories also about jewels. In Alfonso's Clarisalis Disciplinia a serpent was mentioned with eyes of real jacinth, and in the romantic history of Alexander, the conqueror of Emathia, was said to have found in the Vale of Jordan snakes with collars of real emeralds growing on their backs. There was a gem in the brain of the dragon, Philostratus told us, and by the exhibition of golden letters and a scarlet robe, the monster could be thrown into a magical sleep and slain. According to the great alchemist Pierre de Boniface, the diamond rendered a man invisible, and the agate of India made him eloquent. The cornelian appeased anger, and the hyacinth provoked sleep, and the amethyst drove away the fumes of wine. The garnet cast out demons, and the hydropicus deprived the moon of her colour. The silentine waxed and waned with the moon, and the meliceus that discovers thieves could be affected only by the blood of kids. Leonardus Camillus had seen a white stone taken from the brain of a newly killed toad, and was a certain antidote against poison. The bezoar that was found in the heart of the Arabian deer was a charm that could cure the plague. In the nests of Arabian birds was the aspilates, that, according to Democritus, kept the wearer from any danger by fire. But how exotic all of this is. So he's had a passion for music, and we've got all this wonderful stuff from all around the world, and then kind of got a bit kind of over that, and then we've got all this wonderful exploration of jewels, and we're just kind of getting a flavour of how Dorian is living this life of kind of sensuous experience. It continues. Bear with us. Oh, bear with me. The King of Salian rode through his city with a large ruby in his hand at the ceremony of his coronation. The gates of the palace of John the priest were made of sardius, with the horn of the horned snake inwrought, so that no man might bring poison within. Over the gable were 2 golden apples, in which were 2 carbuncles, so that the gold might shine by day, and the carbuncles by night. In Lodge's strange romance, A Marguerite of America, it was stated that in the chamber of the Queen one could behold all the chaste ladies of the world, enchased out of silver, looking through fair mirrors of chrysolites, carbuncles, sapphires, and green emeralds. No, thank you, Henry. Marco Polo had seen the inhabitants of Cipangu place rose-coloured pearls in the mouths of the dead. A sea monster had been enamoured of the pearl that the diver brought to the king for roses, and had slain the thief, and mourned for 7 moons over its loss. When the Huns lured the king into the great pit, he flung it away. Prosopius tells the story, nor was it ever found again, though the Emperor Anastasius offered 500 weight of gold pieces for it. The King of Malabar had shown to a certain Venetian a rosary of 304 pearls, one for every god that he worshipped. When the Duke de Valentinois, that's probably Valentinois. When the Duke de Valentinois, son of Alexander VI, visited Louis XII of France, his horse was loaded with gold leaves according to Brantome, and his cap had double rows of rubies that threw out a great light. Charles of England had ridden in stirrups hung with 421 diamonds. Richard II had a coat valued at 30,000 marks, which was covered with balas rubies. Hall described Henry VIII on his way to the Tower previous to his coronation as wearing a jacket of raised gold, a placard embroidered with diamonds and other rich stones, and a great borderike about his neck of large balasses. The favourites of James I wore earrings of emerald set in gold filigrane. Edward II gave to Piers Gaveston a suit of red gold armour studded with jacinths, a collar of gold roses set with turquoise stones, and a skull-cap parsemé with pearls. You can say hello if you like. This is my other one. I'm recording myself reading this for some of my students. Why? Just in case. I know. You can say hello if you like. This is Edward. And this is Henry. This is quite a long chapter, so it's probably quite nice to have a break of your face. That's a bit interesting. Okay, see you in a bit. I'm just going to finish this off and then I'll be up, okay? See you in a minute. Can you close the door behind you, Edward, please? Bye. Henry II wore jewelled gloves reaching to the elbow and had a hawk glove sewn with 12 rubies and 52 great orients. The ducal hat of Charles the Rash, the last Duke of Burgundy of his race, was hung with pear-shaped pearls and studded with sapphires. How exquisite life had once been! How gorgeous in its pomp and decoration! Even to read of the luxury of the dead was wonderful. Then he turned his attention to embroideries, and to the tapestries that performed the office of frescoes in the chill rooms of the northern nations of Europe. As he investigated the subject, and he always had an extraordinary faculty of becoming absolutely absorbed for the moment in whatever he took up, he was almost saddened by the reflection of the ruin that time brought on beautiful and wonderful things. He, at any rate, had escaped that. Summer followed summer, and the yellow jonquils bloomed and died many times, and nights of horror repeated the story of their shame. But he was unchanged. No winter marred his face or stained his flower-like bloom. How different it was with material things! Where had they passed to? Where was the great crocus-coloured robe on which the gods fought against the giants, that had been worked by grown girls for the pleasure of Athena? Where the huge velarium that Nero had stretched across the Colosseum at Rome, that Titan sail of purple on which was represented the starry sky and Apollo driving a chariot drawn by white gilt-reined steeds? He longed to see the curious table napkins wrought for the priest of the sun, on which were displayed all the dainties and viands that could be wanted for a feast, the mortuary cloth of King Philperic with its 300 golden beads, the fantastic robes that excited the indignation of the Bishop of Pontus, and were figured with lions, panthers, bears, dogs, forests, rocks, hunters, all, in fact, that a painter can copy from nature, and the coat that Charles of Orleans once wore, on the sleeves of which were embroidered the verses of song beginning Madame, je suis tout joyeux. Joyeux? My French accent is appalling, I apologise. The musical accompaniment of the words being wrought in gold thread, and each note of square shape in those days formed with 4 pearls. He read of the room that was prepared at the Palace of Reims for the use of Queen Joan of Burgundy, and was decorated with 1,321 parrots made in broidery, and blazoned with the king's arms, and 561 butterflies, whose wings were similarly ornamented with the arms of the queen, the whole worked in gold. Catherine de' Medici had a mourning bed made for her of black velvet powdered with crescents and suns. Its curtains were of damask, with leafy wreaths and garlands figured upon a gold and silver ground, and fringed along the edges with broideries of pearls, and it stood in a room hung with rows of the Queen's devices in cut black velvet upon cloth of silver. Louis XIV had gold embroidered caryatides 15 feet high in his apartment. The state bed of Sobieski, King of Poland, was made of Smyrna gold brocade, embroidered in turquoises with verses from the Koran. Its supports were of silver gilt, beautifully chased, and profusely set with enamelled and jewelled medallions. It had been taken from the Turkish camp before Vienna, and the standard of Mohammed had stood beneath the tremulous gilt of its canopy. And so, for a whole year, he sought to accumulate the most exquisite specimens that he could find of textile and embroidered work, getting the dainty Delhi muslins, finely wrought with gold thread palmates, and stitched over with iridescent beetles' wings, the Dhaka gauzes that from their transparency are known in the East as woven air and running water and evening dew, strange figured cloths from Java, elaborate yellow Chinese hangings, books bound in tawny satins, or fair blue silks and wrought with fleur-de-lis, birds and images, veils of lassets worked in Hungary point, Sicilian brocades and stiff Spanish velvets, Georgian work with its gilt coins and Japanese ucuses, with their green-toned golds and their marvellously plumaged birds. He had a special passion also for ecclesiastical vestments, as indeed he had for everything connected with the service of the church. In the long cedar chests that lined the west gallery of his house he had stored away many rare and beautiful specimens of what is really the raiment of the bride of Christ, who must wear purple and jewels and fine linen, that she may hide the pallid, macerated body that is worn by the suffering that she seeks for, and wounded by self-inflicted pain. He possessed a gorgeous coat of crimson silk and gold thread damask, figured with a repeating pattern of golden pomegranates set in 6-petaled formal blossoms, beyond which on either side was the pineapple device wrought in seed pearls. The orphreys were divided into panels representing scenes from the life of the Virgin, and the coronation of the Virgin was figured in coloured silks upon the hood. This was Italian work of the 15th century. Another coat was of green velvet, embroidered with heart-shaped groups of acanthus leaves, from which spread long-stemmed white blossoms, the details of which were picked out with silver thread and coloured crystals. The morse bore a seraph's head in gold thread raised work. The orphreys were woven in a diaper of red and gold silk, and were starred with medallions of many saints and martyrs, among whom was St. Sebastian. He had chasubles also of amber-coloured silk and blue silk and gold brocade, and yellow silk damask and cloth of gold, figured with representations of the Passion and Crucifixion of Christ, and embroidered with lions and peacocks and other emblems, dalmatics of white satin and pink silk damask, decorated with tulips and dolphins and fleur-de-lis, altar frontals of crimson velvet and blue linen, and many corporals, chalice veils, and sudaria. In the mystic offices to which such things were put, there was something that quickened his imagination. For those treasures and everything that he collected in his lovely house were to be to him means of forgetfulness, modes by which he could escape for a season from the fear that seemed to him at times to be almost too great to be borne. Upon the walls of the lonely locked room where he had spent so much of his boyhood, he had hung with his own hands the terrible portrait whose changing features showed him the real degradation of his life, and in front of it had draped the purple and gold pall as a curtain. For weeks he would not go there, would forget the hideous painted thing, and get back his light heart, his wonderful joyousness, his passionate absorption in mere existence. Then, suddenly, some night he would creep out of the house, go down to dreadful places near Bluegate Fields, and stay there day after day until he was driven away. On his return he would sit in front of the picture, sometimes loathing it and himself, but filled at other times with that pride of individualism that is half the fascination of sin, and smiling with secret pleasure at the misshapen shadow that had to bear the burden that should have been his own. I'm just going to pause just there. So effectively what he's saying there is that he gets these passions and these interests, and he's able to forget kind of the fear of what's going on with his soul, and then he'll go and do something that's a bit simple and then go look at the painting again. And essentially what we're getting the idea is that he may be living the life of Riley at the minute, but there are consequences. I just wanted to check what this reference was, because we don't get what this means, Bluegate Fields. So he would, would creep out of the house and go to Bluegate Fields, and that must be significant at the time. I'm just checking in the notes section. Okay, so dreadful places near Bluegate Fields, south of Whitechapel and close to Shadwell. This area had a reputation for vice and criminality throughout most of the 19th century. It was also known for its opium dens, and we later learn that Dorian makes occasional trips to the docks to visit such establishments. So effectively, it's suggesting to us that he's sneaking out to go and take drugs, and if you were addicted to drugs and you were taking drugs, as happens now, that has a consequence on your body, and also here, I guess, also his soul. There's a simple aspect to this, which is why it's having an impact on the painting. Okay, so I just keep checking the time. I'm aware this is going to be a really long episode. After a few years he could not endure to be long out of England, and gave up the villa that he had shared at Treville with Lord Henry, as well as the little white-walled inn-house at Algiers, where they had more than once spent the winter. He hated to be separated from the picture that was such a part of his life, and was also afraid that during his absence someone might gain access to the room in spite of the elaborate bars that he had caused to be placed upon the door. He was quite conscious that this would tell him nothing. It was true that the portrait still preserved, under all the foulness and ugliness of the face, its marked likeness to himself. But what could they learn from that? He would laugh at anyone who tried to taunt him. He had not painted it. What was it to him how vile and full of shame it looked? Even if he told them, would they believe it? Yet he was afraid. Sometimes when he was down at his great house in Nottinghamshire, entertaining the fashionable young men of his own rank, who were his chief companions, and astounding the country by the wanton luxury and gorgeous splendour of his mode of life, he would suddenly leave his guests and rush back to town to see that the door had not been tampered with, and that the picture was still there. What if it should be stolen? The mere thought made him cold with horror. Surely the world would know his secret then. Perhaps the world already suspected it. For, while he fascinated many, there were not a few who distrusted him. He was very nearly blackballed at West End Club, of which his birth and social position fully entitled him to become a member, and it was said that on one occasion, when he was brought by a friend into the smoking room of the Churchill, the Duke of Berwick and another gentleman got up in a marked manner and went out. Blackballed basically means that you get, potentially get banned from a club, and lots of these men's social life would have been about going to a club and hanging around and reading newspapers and drinking and eating meals like with those men that women weren't allowed in. Effectively, you're a man of this class, you just spend your life doing a whole lot of nothing, going, having a great time. And Dorian's taken that to the next level. He's next level living a life, but having no kind of consequence on it in its appearance. Curious stories became current about him after he had passed his 25th year. It was rumoured that he had been seen brawling with foreign sailors in a low den in the distant parts of Whitechapel, and that he consorted with thieves and coiners and knew the mysteries of their trade. His extraordinary absences became notorious, and, when he used to reappear again in society, men would whisper to each other in corners, or pass him with a sneer, or look at him with cold searching eyes, as though they were determined to discover his secret. Of such insolences and attempted slights he, of course, took no notice, and in the opinion of most people his frank debonair manner, his charming boyish smile, and the infinite grace of that wonderful youth that seemed never to leave him, were in themselves a sufficient answer to the calumnies, for so they termed them, that were circulated about him. It was remarked, however, that some of those who had been most intimate with him appeared after a time to shun him. Women who had wildly adored him and for his sake had braved all social censure and set convention at defiance, were soon to grow pallid with shame or horror if Dorian Gray entered the room. Yet these widespread scandals only increased the eyes of many his strange and dangerous charm. His great wealth was a certain element of security. Society, civilized society at least, is never very ready to believe anything to the detriment of those who are both rich and fascinating. It feels instinctively that manners are of more importance than morals, and, in its opinion, the highest respectability is of much less value than the position of a good chef. And, after all, it is a very poor consolation to be told that the man who has given one a bad dinner or poor wine is irreproachable in his private life. Even the cardinal virtues cannot atone for half-cold entrees, as Lord Henry remarked once in a discussion on the subject, and there is possibly a good deal to be said for his view. For the canons of good society are, or should be, the same as the canons of art. Form is absolutely essential to it. It should have the dignity of a ceremony, as well as its unreality, and should combine the insincere character of a romantic play with the wit and beauty that made such plays delightful to us. Is insincerity such a terrible thing? I think not. It is merely a method by which we can multiply our personalities. Such, at any rate, was Dorian Gray's opinion. He used to wonder at the shallow psychology of those who conceive the ego in man as a thing simple, permanent, reliable, and of one essence. To him, man was a being with myriad lives and myriad sensations, a complex, multiform creature that bore within itself strange legacies of thought and passion, and whose very flesh was tainted with the monstrous maladies of the dead. He loved to stroll through the gaunt, cold picture gallery of his country house, and look at the various portraits of those whose blood flowed in his veins. Here was Philip Herbert, described by Francis Osborne in his memoirs on the reigns of Queen Elizabeth and King James, as one who was caressed by the court for his handsome face, which kept not long company. Was it young Herbert's life that he sometimes led? Had some strange poisonous germ crept from body to body till it had reached his own? Was it some dim, dense sense of that ruined grace that had made him so suddenly and almost without cause give utterance in Basil Hallward's studio to the mad prayer that had so changed his life? Here, in gold-embroidered red doublet, jewelled surcoat, and gilt-edged ruff and wristbands, stood Sir Anthony Sherard, with his silver and black armour piled at his feet. What had this man's legacy been? Had the lover of Giovanna of Naples bequeathed him some inheritance of sin and shame? Were his own actions merely the dreams that the dead man had not dared to realise? Here, from the fading canvas, smiled Lady Elizabeth Devereux, in her gauze hood, pearl stomacher, and pink slashed sleeves. A flower was in her right hand, and her left clasped an enamelled collar of white and damask roses. On a table by her side lay a mandolin and an apple. There were large green rosettes upon her little pointed shoes. He knew her life and strange stories that were told about her lovers. Had he something of her temperament in him? These oval, heavy-lidded eyes seemed to look curiously at him. What of George Willoughby, with his powdered hair and fantastic patches? How evil he looked! The face was saturnine and swarthy, and the sensual lips seemed to be twisted with disdain. Delicate lace ruffles fell over the lean yellow hands that were so overladen with rings. He had been a macaroni of the 18th century, and the friend, in his youth, of Lord Ferrars. What of the second Lord Beckenham, the companion of the Prince Regent in his wildest days, and one of the witnesses at the second marriage with Mrs. Fitzherbert? How proud and handsome he was, with his chestnut curls and insolent pearls! What passions had he bequeathed? The world had looked upon him as infamous. He had led the orgies at Carlton House. The Star of the Garter glittered upon his breast. Beside him hung the portrait of his wife, a pallid, thin-lipped woman in black. Her blood also stirred within him. How curious it all seemed! And his mother, with her Lady Hamilton face and her moist, wine-dashed lips. He knew what he had got from her. He had got from her his beauty and his passion for the beauty of others. She laughed at him in her loose, bacchanty dress. There were vine leaves in her hair. The purple spilled from the cup she was holding. The carnations of the painting had withered, but the eyes were still wonderful in their depth and brilliancy of colour. They seemed to follow him wherever he went. Yet one had ancestors in literature, as well as in one's own race, nearer perhaps in type and temperament. Many of them, and certainly with an influence of which one was more absolutely conscious. There were times when it appeared to Dorian Gray that the whole of history was merely the record of his own life, not as he had lived it in act and circumstances, but as his imagination had created it for him, as it had been in his brain and in his passions. He felt that he had known them all, those strange, terrible figures that had passed across the stage of the world and made sin so marvellous and evil, so full of subtlety. It seemed to him that in some mysterious way their lives had been his own. The hero of the wonderful novel that had so influenced his life had himself known this curious fancy. In the 7th chapter he tells how, crowned with laurel, lest lightning might strike him, he had sat, as Tiberius, in a garden at Capri, reading the shameful books of Elephantis, while dwarfs and peacocks strutted around him, and the flute-player mocked the swinger of the censer, and as Caligula had caroused with the green-shirted jockeys in their stables and supped in an ivory manger with a jewel-fronted horse, and as Domitian had wandered through a corridor lined with marble mirrors, looking round with haggard eyes for the reflection of the dagger that was to end his days, and sick with that ennui, that terrible tedium vitae that comes on those to whom life denies nothing, and had peered through a clear emerald at the red shambles of the circus, and then in a litter of pearl and purple drawn by silver-shod mules, had been carried through the streets of pomegranates to a house of gold, and heard men cry on Nero Caesar as he passed by, and as Elega, I feel like this chapter is really sent to test me. Elega, Elegabilis, Elegabilis had painted his face with colours and piled the distaff among the women, and brought the moon from Carthage and given her in mystic marriage to the sun. Over and over Dorian used to read this fantastic chapter and the 2 chapters immediately following, in which, as in some curious tapestries of cunningly wrought enamels, were pictured the awful and beautiful forms of those whom vice and blood and weariness had made monstrous or mad. Filippo, Duke of Milan, who slew his wife, and painted her lips with a scarlet poison that her lover might suck death from the dead thing he fondled. Pietro Barbi, the Venetian known as Paul II, who sought in his vanity to assume the title of Formosus, and whose tiara, valued at 200,000 florins, was bought at the price of a terrible sin. Gian Maria Visconti, who used hounds to chase living men, and whose murdered body was covered with roses by a harlot who had loved him. The Borgia on his white horse with fratricide riding beside him, and his mantle stained with the blood of Perotto, Pietro Riario, the young Cardinal Archbishop of Florence, child and minion of Sixtus IV, whose beauty was equalled only by his debauchery, and who received Leonora of Aragon in a pavilion of white and crimson silk, filled with nymphs and centaurs, and gilded a boy that he might serve at the feast as Ganymede or Hylas. Ezelin, whose melancholy could be cured only by the spectacle of death, and who had a passion for red blood as other men have for red wine. The son of the fiend, as was reported, and one who had cheated his father at dice when gambling with him for his own soul. Giambattista Cibo, who in mockery took the name of Innocent, and into whose torpid veins the blood of 3 lads was infused by a Jewish doctor. Sigismondo Malatesta, the lover of Isotta and the lord of Rimini, whose effigy was burned at Rome as the enemy of God, and the man who strangled Polissena with a napkin and gave poison to Minerva d'Este in a cup of emerald, and in honour of a shameful passion built a pagan church for Christian worship. Charles VI, who had so wildly adored his brother's wife that a leper had warned him of the insanity that was coming on him, and who, with his brain had sickened and grown strange, could only be soothed by Saracen cards painted with the images of love and death and madness, and in his trim jerkin and jewelled cap and acanthus-like curls, Griffonetto Baglioni, who slew a story with his bride, and Simonetto with his page, and whose comeliness was such that, as he lay dying in the yellow piazza of Perugia, those who had hated him could not choose but weep, and Atlanta, who had cursed him, blessed him. There was a horrible fascination in them all. He saw them at night, and they troubled his imagination in the day. The Renaissance knew of strange manners of poisoning by a helmet and a lighted torch, by an embroidered glove and a jewelled fan, by a gilded pomander and by an amber chain. Dorian Gray had been poisoned by a book. There were moments when he looked on evil simply as a mode through which he could realise his conception of the beauty. And if you have genuinely listened to all of that, Uh, you deserve some kind of medal. Honestly, what a chapter! This is so self-indulgent, this chapter. I guess too, if I too long didn't read, basically, Dorian's been having a great whale of a time, loads of experiences, trying to work out where kind of his character comes from. Well done if you've made it through that. Hopefully this won't take me all day to upload. I'm just looking at the time. If you did listen to all of that, can you email me, and if I can find some way to reward you for your patience, if you listened to all of that without skipping, or just skipping to the next chapter, well done. I promise you the next few chapters are shorter and less kind of indulgent. Gee, Oscar Wilde, honestly. Okay, anyway, I hope you've had a good first day of the month. Wednesday's hump day, so like we're going into the end of the week, so that's always a good thing, isn't it? Getting to the weekend. And I wish you all the best. And if you need to email me, you've got any questions, queries, concerns, then do get in contact, and we'll do what we can. Have a good rest of your Wednesday.